Hi guys, welcome back to the Bird Photography Show with Glenn Bartley.
Hello.
And me, Jan Wegener. And today we want to talk all about birds in flight photography and share our tips and secrets with you, how you can take amazing birds in flight images as well. And I've seen that you, Glenn, have taken a lot of amazing tiny swallows in flight images. So I thought you could talk us through the process that you've gone through to capture those amazing shots.
This spring, I couldn't go anywhere. I had to stay locally, but then I thought, what could I do differently close to home? And immediately what came to mind were these beautiful violet green swallows. And they live right here in Victoria where I live, so I thought I should really try to photograph these swallows. So I started trying to find a good spot, because one of the key things with bird photography is having a great spot in order to achieve the photos that you're after. I needed it to be a kind of where there was a bit of turbulent weather. The wind made it so that the food was easier for them to get down low, close to the water. And not only that, the wind really helped me out because, as we all know, swallows are super fast, erratic flying birds. But in the wind, it slowed them down just a little bit that made it more possible. I was shooting them with my 600mm lens and oftentimes even with the 1.4 converter on, and I was ultimately very happy with some of the shots I got. What I really wanted with the violet green was something that showed its characteristic, what it's named after, that showed the green and the purple. Tell us down in the comments what you think. Did I nail it or what?
You definitely did really well there getting those images. Can you maybe share before and after image with us as well, so we can see how much you cropped and kind of how you edited that file as well?
Yeah, for sure. It wasn't a huge amount of really fancy editing going on in this one, but if you guys want to learn to take your images to the next level, we've got some links for you down in the description.
With those swallows and all birds in flights, you usually have to have a high shutter speed to freeze that action. Were you particularly fast with the shutter speed in this case?
For sure. Well, definitely you nailed it there. I mean, when it comes to birds in flight, you're always thinking first and foremost about speed. So I knew I really had to keep my shutter speed super fast. I believe that photo was at 5,000th of a second, but I was really trying to keep it like 3,200, 4,000, 5,000, up in that range, because they're just so fast. I would say probably for most birds in flight, I try to keep it at least a 2,000th of a second. What about you, Jan?
For me, a 2,000th of a second would definitely be kind of a minimum as well. And I think there's one distinction we need to make as well between whether you're panning with the bird or whether you're stationary on a tripod, for instance, and then you're photographing a bird that's kind of just flying through your screen because it's taking off a nest or taking off from a perch. Because if you're panning with the bird, you will be able to have slower shutter speeds and still get a sharp image. But from my experience, at least, if I'm at a water spot and there's a perch and I know the bird's going to jump down to the water, just quickly flying through my screen, and I want to freeze that action, I usually have to have at least a 4,000th of a second or a 6,400th of a second.
That's a good point about the stationary tripod. Now, of course, that brings us into a nice segue into, well, what do we all need if we want to have a fast shutter speed? Usually we, of course, also have to consider our aperture and our ISO. So the ISO, it's obviously going to depend on your conditions in order to achieve, because shutter speed is the most important thing. So you're going to have to put your ISO wherever it needs to go in order to achieve those shutter speeds.
Typically, birds in flight are a bit further away from us anyway, so we can actually shoot wide open and it's not as much of a concern, or depth of field is not as much of a concern, simply because the bird is a lot further away and you just have a lot more depth of field on the bird. But typically with most lenses, especially if I'm shooting with a 1.4 extender, I would probably try to stop down a little bit because it gives you a little bit of extra sharpness. But most important is definitely the shutter speed.
You're going to have these fleeting moments where the bird is where you want it. And of course, you want to get as many frames as possible when they happen to come through your sweet spot. So highest possible frame rate is always a benefit. And that's where these mirrorless cameras are really showing one of their true strengths. And the camera that I was shooting with could shoot at 20 frames a second. And of course, some of them now can even shoot at 30 frames a second. So if you have just literally one moment and you happen to get all those extra frames,
the more frames you have is definitely better for birds in flight photography. And there's obviously something that a few of these cameras have in the electronic shutter mode, and that's the rolling shutter, where it heavily distorts a wing, or if you have trees in the background, they might all be a little bit on an angle. And I've found that for birds in flight, because there's typically no kind of straight elements in our frame, and if we're panning with the bird, that rolling shutter is really not a problem. But where I've seen it happen, it's the only time it actually happened to me, is when I was shooting these birds that were flying through my screen from a perch, and I was just stationary on a tripod. Just every time the bird would take off, I was just clicking away. That's where I sometimes could see like a wing that was just really bent upwards and like longer than normal. Knowing your frame rate and your buffer size is actually important as well, especially when you're shooting with like a slower framed camera like we've done in the past with a 5D or 7D. And if you shoot too early, what often will happen, you fill up your buffer before the bird is actually in the spot where you want to take your photo. So I think if you have a camera that might only do 5, 6, 7 frames per second and has a buffer of like 20 frames, you actually have to know that those 20 frames in your buffer will fill up in no time. So you actually have to be patient and control yourself. So you wait until the bird is almost in the spot that you pre-selected where you want to take your photos, and then you start firing away, because otherwise you might end up with that horrible click, click, click sound, and you just see the bird go out of your frame and you don't get any shots. So I think that's important to keep in mind, especially on the slower cameras that don't have such a big buffer.
There's this rumor that when you're doing flight photography, I always get people asking, do you turn your IS off? And to be honest, I usually don't turn it off, but in these swallows, because what I'd heard is if it's a really fast shutter speed, that sometimes the IS can actually get in the way of that really fast shutter speed. This is like a rumor that I had heard, but I have not fact checked at all. So in these ones, I was actually doing something I normally don't do, and I turned IS off. So what about you, Jan? Do you leave it on or off when it comes to flight shooting?
This is a very interesting point, Glenn, because I never turn off my ES. And I've had a few comments recently where people ask me exactly about this, well, let's call it issue. And so I did a little bit of reading more on that, because I started to think, am I doing something wrong here? Am I giving the wrong advice, just staying on the IS? And let me first share why I never turn off the S. First of all, I feel like, especially now with the R5 as well and the IBIS, it really stabilizes my viewfinder a lot. So I actually find it easier to track the birds. If I turn off the IS and the IBIS, my whole lens setup becomes a lot more shaky, and I find it a lot more difficult to kind of track the birds. Whereas with the IBIS and the IS on my viewfinder, it's really nice and smooth, and it helps me tracking the birds. And the other issue I had, if I turn the IS off, I don't always remember to turn it back on. So then sometimes I do birds in flight photography, and then the next day I'm shooting in a forest and I have only blurry images. I'm like, oh my God, what happened here? And then I see, oh, you turned the IS off last night. So
I've definitely had that happen.
So that was the main two reasons why I left it on. And then I did a bit of reading where they had a few arguments for leaving it on all the time. One of the main arguments were that if you say that a fast shutter speed can remove any or freeze any sort of shake from your hands, why would it not also freeze any sort of movement from the image stabilization? That was their first point for it. And the second point that I found really interesting was that they said that your autofocus system actually sees the same what you are seeing. They were basically saying, if your camera is really shaky, this is also what your autofocus is seeing. So if your picture is much more stable and you're tracking the bird much smoother, your autofocus will also benefit from that, because it's easier for the autofocus to stay on the subject. And I thought that was a very interesting point. And so going forward, I will definitely leave it on, and I've always left it on in the past and I haven't really seen any difference. So it'd be interesting. We might want to test that out again, but I think there's a lot of points for it to be left on.
Why don't you guys let us know down in the comments, do you leave IS on or VR on or off when you're out shooting? And maybe we'll get a bit of a group discussion and reach consensus once and for all. Leave it on or take it off. One other thing I wanted to mention, Jan, before we leave lens settings, is the fact that a lot of lenses have a focus limiter. When I'm doing flight shooting, I always pay attention to this setting because it can really help the speed of your lens acquiring focus. For example, I know the bird's not going to fly so close to me in that minimum focus range. So I don't want the lens, if it misses target, to have to hunt all the way back. I only want it to focus in that certain sweet spot that I'm really looking for. So I always think about, okay, if the bird's going to be further than that far distance, I might as well put it in that and it'll speed things along.
So now we've talked so much about the settings and the lens, but we haven't actually talked about maybe the most important feature when it comes to birds and flight photography, the autofocus and how to set it up. And I think we really have to distinguish here between the more modern mirrorless cameras that have automated tracking that can actually track the bird by itself, and the more traditional DSLR cameras that we've used for many, many years, where you have to, well, more or less manually select the focus fields and then keep the focus field on the bird, or the camera will focus like away from the bird. So in the past, when I was using like a 5D or 1DX, for instance, I would usually select either like a small zone, or I have like one autofocus field with the surrounding fields activated. So when I was slightly slipping off the bird, some of those autofocus fields around that field would still pick up the bird and help me to stay on the bird. But all in all, it was always quite difficult.
One of the things that can be really confusing in the Canon, and probably in all the platforms, is there's these like different like focus modes, like different like dynamic kind of sliders, and they're kind of not that intuitive. Like you'd think like, oh, I'm doing something that's fast, I should put them all to the right, to the faster setting. But the reality is you kind of want to do the opposite of that. One of them is like if something's an erratic subject. Well, birds don't fly erratically. They fly pretty much in a straight line. Another one is, do you want it to try to focus on new things if they come into the viewfinder? Well, like if a bird goes behind a branch or a tree, well, no, I don't want to focus on the tree. You want it to, once it's locked on the subject, stay on the subject, again, over to the left. And the other one is if they accelerate or decelerate quickly. And again, birds, once they're flying, that's pretty much the speed they're flying. Like they don't really change speed once they're flying. So the truth is that most of those settings, you want them to be kind of far to the left. And sometimes that can help you, at least to, once you've got the bird in focus, to keep it in focus. Now, one other thing we always had to do with DSLRs, which doesn't work that well with mirrorless cameras, was what I would call pumping the focus, where when you're trying to get the bird in focus, if you can tell that it's not quite in focus, you'd try to keep pumping the focus, or back button, if you will, and get it to lock onto the bird. But with mirrorless, that technique is not as effective, is it? What do you think, Jan?
No, I think that's a good point. First, about the cases, that's definitely helpful. And I found myself doing the same thing on the 5D and actually on the R5 as well. I'm both using the case 1, and I've dialed both of them manually back to -1. So they're a bit more slow in responding, and that's working quite well for me. And when it comes to the focus pumping, I guess the idea on the DSLR cameras was that if you focus the whole time, the chance of the DSLR camera losing the bird was just infinitely high pretty much. So we always wanted to keep it sharp enough that it would find it again, but we did not want to focus on it the whole time. You kind of wanted to bump it until it comes to your critical zone, and then focus and try to keep the focus on it for this short period of time. With, as you say, with the new mirrorless cameras and the live tracking, and especially the eye tracking on the Canon and the Sony A1, the bird's eye tracking, it's now, oh, there's the visitor. It's now a lot easier for us to simply focus on the bird and then just keep the button pressed, because I don't really have it that the eye autofocus just jumps off the bird completely. Like that almost never happens to me. So now I definitely pre-focus on the bird when it starts flying, or I can just see it in my viewfinder. I press the button, for me the back button that activates the animal eye tracking, and then it will just track the bird basically the whole time. And if it ever loses it, I can quickly let it go and press again, and it will find it again. What you have to learn as well, especially with the long lenses, is that kind of hand-eye coordination, where you actually need to be able to look at the bird and then point your lens at the bird and have the bird in the viewfinder right away. Because the more focal length you have for flight shots, the harder it is, obviously. I mean, even getting a little swallow in the viewfinder at 840 millimeters in flight is not something that anyone could just do. There's a lot of coordination and training there that allows you to actually follow the swallow with your eyes and then get it in the camera, because you probably didn't try and follow the swallow for like a minute through your viewfinder. You kind of follow it with your eyes, and when it comes to the right direction, you rip up your camera and you try and get it.
Mostly we've been talking about technical things and settings, but when it comes to the skill of taking flight shots, what I call it is, you said hand-eye coordination, I call it eye-lens coordination, where you can see something moving even as fast as a swallow and lift your lens up, and at the same time you know where you're going to need to be pointing and track that object. And that takes a lot of practice to get good at. The other thing that is absolutely critical to getting good flight shots is pre-focusing and predicting where you're going to want to pick that bird up. Because if you're focused out at like 80 meters, and then you try to lift your lens up and pick up a bird that's at 20 meters, all you're going to see is a big blur. You're not going to see anything. And there's no chance you're going to be able to pick that bird up. But if I know, okay, that's my zone over there that I want to try to pick the bird up, it's about 30, 40 meters, or better yet, just focus on something close by. And then I'm basically waiting for something to fly into that range. And then I can pick it up and then let it get into my sweet spot and then hammer away, try to get a shot. That's really the critical like technique of getting good flight shots.
So obviously the lens that you want to be using for flight shots heavily depends on your subject. And you and I often use our 600mm lens. For instance, for that region parrot we talked about a few episodes ago, I was using the 600 actually on a tripod. But if I had a choice, the 600 wouldn't really be my preferred lens. I would like to use the 100 to 500, for instance. It's not always long enough, so there's always a trade-off. But generally speaking, if you have a lighter lens with faster autofocus, that will typically get you better results, especially if it's more like traditional birds like ducks or herons or pelicans or something?
It depends on sort of where you're at in your photographic journey, your own physical attributes, but like obviously hand holding a 600mm lens is not going to be accessible for everybody. And also if you're just getting started out, you're not going to immediately get those skills. So it's definitely going to be better to start with a shorter lens with slower flying birds for sure. You mentioned that you're using the 100 to 500, and that's actually quite a big bonus because you've got that extra 100mm than the 100 to 400 that I tend to use. So it would actually, I would love to see Canon make like a 200 to 600 like the Sony or something that was lighter and faster, and that could be an amazing flight lens. But ultimately, if I can get the more pixels on the subject and I think I can do it, I'll probably be reaching for my 600.
So now we've talked about the cameras and the kind of technical aspects and what you have to do, but obviously we're out in nature. There's also conditions that affect flight photography, and especially the sun and the wind are two things that are very important when it comes to flight photography, because if it's not sunny, it's less likely you will get the nice high shutter speed, and often with flight photography the sky is at least partially involved, and then sky or water on a cloudy day become a really unpleasant grey color. So typically bluer skies with some clouds, because that will look better, will probably be the preferred choice when it comes to flight photography. Get the high shutter speed and the nice colors. And also wind. If you don't have the right wind direction, you're just lost, because birds just like to land and take off into the wind. So it's very important that the wind comes from the right direction, or you might only see bird bumps the whole day. It's hard to predict where birds will fly past you. So oftentimes you just end up with a background that's not very ideal. And then the only way to get really pleasing birds in flight images is actually go out and find locations where you know if there's a bird flying through here, I will get a really nice shot because there's like a really nice distant background, for instance. So a lot of times you and I would probably find flight shot opportunities, but we don't actually go and take those images simply because we deem the location unsuitable, or we know we just wouldn't get a pleasant image here. So it's all about finding those locations where you can have the right wind, the right light behind you, and also we know that if we get a bird through here, we get a pleasant background.
This is what I call learning how to see. Learning how to see through a photographer's eyes. You know, when you're starting out as a photographer, you wonder what you could do to take a better photo. And sometimes it's like, you couldn't have done anything better. You were shooting in bad conditions, the light was bad, you didn't have the right parameters to anything you did, you would have never come up with a great photo. And learning to recognize what will potentially give you a great photo is one of the really important skills to develop, and it comes from spending lots of time out in nature trying to photograph birds, really. Sometimes there's conditions where I actually prefer shooting in bright overcast light with flight shooting, as long as it's pretty bright, because sometimes I find if I'm going to have like definitely not a sky background, and definitely not a water background, but if they're going to be flying against trees, sometimes I find that those flat light conditions can totally eliminate the shadows that can be so prevalent in flight shots. If the light angle's like this and the bird is flying this way, it's flying into the light, and when it gets into your sweet spot, it's the perfect kind of angle for the bird. So in a perfect scenario, if you can imagine this with me, the sun is coming this way, the bird is flying this way, and the wind is going that way, slowing the bird down. That's what I would consider to be the perfect conditions for flight photography.
To finish up our discussion about bird and flight photography today, Glenn and I just want to share our top tips with you now so you can also go out and nail those amazing flight images.
All right, so let's start with the camera settings. As we discussed, the shutter speed is the most important thing, and you're going to need to do whatever you need to do with your ISO. And your aperture, you're usually going to be shooting fairly wide open, but you might stop down like maybe one stop. You're also going to want to use the camera's fastest drive mode.
When it comes to the settings on the lens, we've already discussed IS or no IS. We definitely think we should leave your IS on, and if your lens has a focus limiter, it can be very helpful to set it to a larger distance so your camera doesn't have to hunt to hold back from infinity to minimum focusing distance when it's looking for the birds.
Now, the most important settings, the autofocus settings. It depends if you're using a mirrorless camera, and especially a mirrorless camera that has the bird eye detect. If you have that, you're definitely going to want to use that. If not, you're going to be using a more manual approach, and we probably want to put the autofocus point in the center with some type of assist points or a small zone around the center. You're definitely going to want to be using continuous focusing or AFC, and you're going to want to look at the specific parameters of your camera's autofocus, such as the tracking sensitivity and the different speeds.
And when it comes to the techniques in the field, it's important that you pre-focus onto the distance that you expect the bird to pass through your viewfinder. And it's also important that you train your eye-lens coordination. So you learn to look at a spot and then be able to point your camera directly at the spot without having to look through your viewfinder. This will make it much faster for you to find those fast flying birds. When it comes to hand holding or tripods, it really comes down to your personal taste, but typically we would say it's much easier to follow birds if you're hand holding your camera and lens.
And lastly, when it comes to the lighting conditions and the wind conditions, these are really critical elements. Of course, you want the sun behind you and you want the bird flying into the light angle. And when it comes to the wind can definitely affect the direction that the birds will be wanting to take off and land. And very importantly, the wind, you want it to be your friend. You want to get it on your side, and you want it to be blowing into the bird's face as they're flying so that it slows them down and makes your job easier.
And then when it comes to the location and the background, it's important that you find the right spots where you know that you're going to get nice backgrounds. You could have the best bird with the best pose, but if you're not in the right location, you will just not get those really nice, pleasing backgrounds.
All right, folks. Well, thanks so much for staying tuned into this episode where we talked all about birds in flight. To reward you for your patience, we've got a little giveaway. We've got this beautiful book here, The Birds of Instagram by David Allen Sibley and Chris Gatcomb. And look at that, it's my shot on the cover. We want to give away a few copies of this book to you guys, the viewers of the Bird Photography Show, as a little thank you for watching our show, for subscribing, and for staying tuned in. So, what we need you to do if you want to enter to win a copy of this book is write us a comment down below, and at the end of your comment, tell us your favorite bird to photograph, and also tell us where you live, because this contest is open to people who live in North America or Australia. So I'm sorry to everyone else, but the publisher, that's where they were willing to send them. So tell us your favorite bird and where you're from, and we'll try to get you a copy of this beautiful book.
Glenn and I will announce the 2 winners in one of our next videos. We really hope you enjoyed today's insight into bird and flight photography and hope that you can utilize some of our tips in the field to take better bird images yourself. Let us know in the comments, what's your preferred bird and flight photography combo, and how have you gone with taking birds and flight images so far? Is it easy for you or are you struggling? Let us know. Also make sure to give it a thumbs up and share the video with all your friends and subscribe to the channel.
In our next episode, we are going to be talking all about budget bird photography kits at different price settings. So we hope you'll stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for watching this episode, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.